Morality, of course, as we've just been discussing, is how you choose to live. If we believe that we are, in fact, the progeny of a supernatural creator, then we will choose to live as he asks us to live. As he said in the Bible, be ye therefore holy. Why? For I am holy. Therefore, he gives us a reason to live the way that we choose to live. And last but not least, where am I going? Well, frankly, if you're an atheist or an agnostic, you know, you're not going anywhere, at least not from your perspective. You're just going into the dirt. You will decompose and you will never be. But I don't think that anybody really believes that in their heart of hearts. The Bible says in Psalm chapter 14 and verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. You know why I think the Bible says that? Not because it's calling anybody names, not because it's being pejorative, but because it's saying, for somebody to say in their heart of hearts that God doesn't exist is so totally ridiculous because people know in their heart of hearts that they were made for something bigger, greater, and grander than this present world. I think we know intuitively that death is not the end. Our sense of justice is not answered if death is not the end. Our sense of meaning is not answered to if death is not the end. There's just too much meaning and substance to life for death to be the end. And therefore we conclude, this is our final slide, if the answer to the first question is yes, does God exist, and I believe that there is compelling reason to suggest that he does, then it is a foregone conclusion that the answer to the latter would also be in the affirmative. Oh, there's my first spelling error. The first one I saw at least. Would also be in the affirmative. If God exists, then he is the supreme and original reality from which all other realities derive their meaning and significance. You follow that? If God exists, then he is the supreme and original reality from which all other realities derive their meaning and significance. Have we proved tonight that God exists? No, not in the mathematical sense or even in the scientific sense. But I think we have given a brief yet compelling case that the preponderance of evidence seems to suggest that there is a transcendent, supernatural, illimitable being that did in fact begin this thing that we call life. Okay? Thank you very much. We would just take a few questions. If there are any questions directly related to this material, if it's not directly related to this material, then we'll probably put it off to another night when we actually start on time. Okay? Sir?
How do scientists deal with some of the things that you talked about tonight?
It's a very good question. If you're talking about like the law of abiogenesis, the answer is they don't deal with it. They just assume that it must have happened. And the proof that it must have happened is that we're here. Of course, their assumption at the outset is that God doesn't exist. And that's actually what you begin to find. Philosophers of science have noted that the definition, the current definition of science, which is by definition atheistic, is an inadequate definition because it rules out a whole other reality which is possible, namely that God could exist. And so it's a little bit like saying, we know for fact that life evolved from non-life because, after all, we're here. Now, you could challenge and say, but how do you know that life evolved from non-life? And their response would be, because we're here. Well, how do you know that? Well, because we're here. And they would revert to the classic, God can't be seen, God can't be touched, God can't be put into a test tube, he can't be measured, and therefore we factor God out of science.
So then science really isn't a search for truth?
Science is a search for a certain kind of truth, absolutely, absolutely. Science is a search for what you might call empirical, or, science is a search for a certain kind of truth, but scientists need to recognize their limitations. And that's really where scientists, some, not all, scientists aren't bad people, not by any stretch, but there are people like Stephen Jay Gould, who died recently of cancer, who was a Harvard paleontologist, who would lambast Christians and people that believed in creation. Why? Because he was taking he's taking the fact that, moths in England that landed on certain trees, became white and certain became black, which, by the way, has been totally disproven now. Interesting.
I remember learning that.
Yeah, so he's taking that, and then he's extrapolating that God doesn't exist. That's a remarkable extrapolation. So what happens is that some of these scientists, have actually stepped outside of the realm of what's measurable in a laboratory, and they start making inferences for the rest of us, moral and philosophical inferences. Many scientists don't do that. Good scientists don't do that. Of course, all true science meets 4 criteria. It must be demonstrable, we can develop a hypothesis about gravity, and let's say that this is going to, we can demonstrate it. It must be observable. If we can't observe it, then it can't be demonstrated, etc. It must be repeatable. If it happened just one time, then we can't set up a control group by which we would test it. And it must be falsifiable. all true science must meet those 4 criteria: demonstrability, observability, falsifiability, and repeatability. And that's where science begins and ends. As soon as a scientist says, therefore God doesn't exist, you know he has stepped out of the realm of science and into the realm of metaphysics. So for many of these scientists, how do they answer these objections? The answer is most scientists are not dealing with these kinds of questions on a day-in, day-out basis. It's just a few cavalier radicals that start extrapolating these God doesn't exist and these kinds of things. You know, your Bertrand Russells, and wasn't even a scientist, of course, but like your Stephen Jay Gould, some of these guys. Interestingly, just as a little point of curiosity, Francis Crick and Watson, the 2 that were responsible for the discovery of the double helical structure of the deoxyribonucleic acid molecule, you know, later in life, Francis Crick actually put forward his thesis as to how he believed the helical structure, the double helical structure of the DNA molecule arrived. And his theory was what he called directed panspermia. Directed panspermia. And that is, by the way, scientific speak for alien seeding. Literally. The founder, one of the 2 founders of the deoxyribonucleic molecule, the double helical structure, literally believes that the best explanation for the existence of life on planet Earth is that aliens put some primordial life. He does believe in evolution, but they put some kind of primordial life into a spaceship. This is not science fiction. You know, this is a credible, you know, Nobel Prize winning, one of the greatest scientists of modernity, that believes that, you know, that the spaceship landed here. Of course, there's no evidence for that, and that it sort of evolved. Because he recognized the reason that they're forced to these ridiculous conclusions is that they recognize that abiogenesis is highly unlikely, that life can arrive from non-life. It's a very good question. I'm not a scientist, but I fancy myself a philosopher of science, an amateur philosopher of science, and most good scientists stick to what they know. They stick to the laboratory, they stick to demonstrability, observability, repeatability, and falsifiability. They don't get involved in all of these things. You'll meet many scientists that are good theists. In fact, interesting, now you've got me started. They just recently done a poll of the National Academy of Scientists. Yeah, National Academy of Science, and the members of that, and they found that there was no statistical difference from the general population to theists, to atheists, to agnostics, to Hindus, to Christians. In other words, what's good for the common folk is good enough for the scientists. There just is nothing about being a scientist that makes you predisposed to atheism. Fascinating. No statistical difference. Anybody else? Questions about tonight's material? Did you find it compelling? Did you? I know I talk fast. I know it. I've been told that by many people. But this is a younger audience, and so you guys can wrap your fingers around it.